process. All right, good evening. Um, there's an old line that says, if you can't laugh at yourself, whom can you laugh at? Actually, you said, at whom can you laugh? So, for those of you who were here in the Mishle class on Sunday night, you'll understand this first slide. If you were not, I'll explain it. Multiple choice question. What class is tonight? Is it Mishle, Jewish history, Pirkei Avot, or none of the above? So for those of you who are clueless, is what this slide means. Sunday night I thought was Tuesday night. And I started teaching my Mishle class, but instead of teaching Mishle, I was teaching Jewish history for the first 5 minutes. And until people started saying something's not right here. So tonight is Tuesday. Tonight is Jewish history. And we're going to jump into that topic tonight. Okay, before we start, I want to share with you one other slide. We'll be all over here for a minute. Yesterday was you could call it a milestone, but it's really a mark in history of shame. It was 50 years to the day. This is yesterday's front page of the Jerusalem Post. 50 years to the day that the United Nations resolution number 3379 was passed, which equated Zionism to racism. It wasn't repealed for another until December. I put it up here, December 16th, 1991. So not only did it leave a black mark on the history of Israel by the United Nations, but it did bring out, if you've never heard Chaim Herzog's speech in response to this resolution, I suggest you go on YouTube at some point. Just type in Chaim Herzog, or Israeli ambassador, Zionism is racism. And he gave a magnificent speech. And it's definitely worthwhile hearing if you've never heard it before. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing, and for those of you who were there on Sunday night and heard the beginning of tonight's class by accident, the first couple minutes will be a bit of a repeat, but that's okay. I don't remember saying it, so maybe you don't remember hearing it. Anyways, so what I did mention was that doing a topic like Zionism, the danger or the difficulty is that it's so broad that when a person like myself or anybody else who's preparing to teach about it, there's this constant, not tension, but there's this like, okay, I'm going to teach this and this. Is that, wait, I really should put this in. That should go in here. So that's where I was struggling with this past, last week after class, to decide if I wanted to add certain pieces to what I was planning on doing. And I decided to add a couple little things. And again, part of the next 2 minutes or so is a repeat from Sunday night, if you heard it. I want to start with going back into the mid-1700s, just for 2 or 3 minutes. What becomes known eventually as the Yishuv HaYashan, which is pre-state Israel, the old Yishuv, the old settlement of the country, when people are first starting to come in groups to the land of Israel. So we're just going to talk a little bit about the early times of the mid to late 1700s into the 1800s for 2 minutes. Then we're going to jump back to where we were. So by the 1700s, the area that would become known eventually as the Yishuv HaYashan is in a period of poverty, a period of dependence, to such an extent that there was a system called the Chalukah. The Chalukah were called Shadarim, people who were sent to Chutz La'aretz, Europe, little in the United States, and mostly Europe, to collect funds that would then be distributed within the Yishuv in order to give them some sustenance, to give them some income. It led to some problems, of course, because you're talking about money, you always have problems. And again, these Shadarim went more to Europe, North Africa, within the Ottoman Empire. I don't necessarily recall seeing that they went for sure to the United States, but it is possible because the United States is still, the early 1800s, there is the United States, late 1700s already. But whether they send people there or not, I don't know. But the Yishuv did become, even though there was poverty, even though there was a tremendous amount of illness and other things, it still became a magnet for certain people. And those kinds of people were the people who were more into the religious aspect, into the concept of the Kedushat Eretz Yisrael, the holiness of the land of Israel. So you have two camps that were polar opposites. If you remember, we talked months ago about the Baal Shem Tov and the Hasidic movement, and then Vilna Gaon, who were the those who were against it. They were the Mitnagdim. They both had people who end up coming to Israel. The Baal Shem Tov and some of his early Hasidim come in the late 1700s to Israel. They're inspired by mystical desires to be in the land of Israel and the idea of redeeming the land of Israel so that it becomes a holy Jewish country. The followers of the Vilna Gaon, who are known as the Prushim, they come from Lithuania, and they start coming in early 1800s, around 1808, and they start to establish communities in Yerushalayim and in Tzfat. The Yemenite Jews are also starting to come. They're making Aliyah and starting to settle in Jerusalem. But as a result of the people, the followers of the Baal Shem Tov and the Yemenite Jews and Vilna Gaon, the four, what become known as the four holy cities of Israel, become settled. And I'm going to tell you something tonight I heard many years ago, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. But first, let me just give you the definitions. They come to Yerushalayim because it's the spiritual capital. That's without Yerushalayim, we don't have anything. It's the spiritual capital, focusing on Torah study, prayer, the proximity to the Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount. Tzfat becomes a mystical center. It's rebuilt after decline. There's going to eventually be a terrible earthquake that does tremendous damage to human life and in physical structure. And there's a very strong presence of Hasidim, strong presence of Sephardic mystics. Tveria is revived by Rebbe Chaim Abulafia in mid-1700s under the Ottoman government, the Ottoman governor who's ruling. The Ottoman are in charge at that point. It later becomes a Hasidic stronghold. And then Hebron. Hebron became very popularized for Sfaradim and Chabad Hasidim. So we see that in the Hasidic and the non-Hasidic world, they start to focus late 1700s, very early 1800s on settling these four holy cities. Years ago, I heard the following, and I thought it was absolutely magnificent, that the four holy cities represent or relate to the four elements in nature. We speak about fire, wind, earth, and water. I know earth, wind, and fire is a nice band, but that's not the point here. Fire, wind, earth, and water. And they are represented in these four cities. Fire is Yerushalayim, because of the concept of korbanot and the fire on the Mizbeach. Wind, which is in Hebrew ruach, that the ruach, the tzfat, becomes and remains one of the center focal points of the spirit of Kabbalah and of mystical Judaism. Tveria, water, being on the Kinneret, and Hebron, the earth, which is this week's parasha, where Abraham Avinu buys Marat HaMachpelah, the earth in which our avot and most of our imahot are buried. So those four holy cities of Israel correspond to the four elements in nature, and they're settled in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And now what I'd like to do is turn our focus back to the mid 1800s to later 1800s and talk about a few of the people involved in the early days. What we have to understand, and this is, I believe, where I left off Sunday night and last week, that Zionism is not monolithic, which means there's not one definition or one path in Zionism. The same thing is true, by the way, in Orthodoxy, in what we call Orthodox Judaism or Dati. You have many, many paths to Hashem. Same thing is true when it comes to the concept of settling the land of Israel, finding a homeland for the Jewish people. There are different drives, there are different reasons, different purposes. And we're going to meet some of the people tonight, next week, who were involved in these things and what their approaches were and how they sometimes butted heads. First person I'm going to talk about is a man named Leo or Yehuda Leib Pinsker. I also had mentioned last week that many of you are familiar with the Rehov Pinsker in Yerushalayim. There's a very tall building that has many, many, many Anglos that live there. I knew of this building already when I was probably before I was a teenager, because we had some people from Chicago early on who already bought apartments there. And the street's named after this individual, Yehuda Leber, Leo Pinsker. He lives for 70 years, 1821 to 1891. And who was he, and what was his spin or his bend or his approach to Zionism? He was a doctor. He was also someone who was considered very intellectual. He was in Odessa, in Russia. He was a devoted assimilationist. What does that mean? It means he didn't just think assimilation was a good idea. He was really a proponent. He wanted to see Jews assimilate. He himself was educated in German universities. He also advocated for Jewish integration into Russian society. And he wrote many essays early on in his career of trying to mend fences between Jews and Russians, that Jews should become more Russian and less Jewish. What happened? What changed his mind? As we've seen with Herzl, what he saw in France with the Dreyfus affair, a similar thing happened to Pinsker. There were pogroms that swept the Russian Empire after Tsar Alexander was assassinated in 1881. That time period of all these pogroms, it destroyed his view of the world, his world view of the concept of emancipation, and that Jews could be easily integrated into Russian society if only it would be less Jewish and more Russian. There was a huge uptick in anti-Semitism. And despite all the promises of emancipation and things are going to get better and Jews are going to become regular citizens, Pinsker concluded that Jewish security was a structural issue, or insecurity, I should say, was a structural issue and not incidental. What does that mean? Let's say you're building a building and one day it's windy and it's knocking some of the construction pieces off the wall on the outside. That's not a part of the building. That's just incidental. But if the foundation is broken, or the foundation's no good, then the whole structure is problematic. And he said that anti-Semitism wasn't something incidental that just happened to be going on, but it was part of the foundation and part of the structure of society. And he felt that the Jews had no future there. So in 1882, he writes a pamphlet called Auto-Emancipation, published it in German. Now, their Judenstaat doesn't appear for a few more years. So this is just before, it's about 8 years before Herzl's Judenstaat, the Jewish state. He publishes it in German, and it's circulated very widely in Europe. And it became a turning point that was really marked by a statement that was similar to something we've seen before at a different time, that Pinsker, so to speak, diagnosed anti-Semitism as a psychological pathology. Remember, he's a doctor, and he comes up with a term called Judeophobia, the fear of Jews, the perception of Jews as a nation without a land, a ghost people. So what does this mean? Okay, I did not realize until quite a while back, before I even was teaching this class, and I started reading about Pinsker, that the idea he'd actually coined this term Judeophobia, and said it was a pathology or psychological pathology. And it makes, by the way, he was not a religious person by any stretch of the imagination, but it makes a very important correlation from that statement to something else. There's a statement that says, Halacha Esav sonei Yaakov. It's a halacha, and I don't want to get into what that means right now, but let's just say it's a fact instead of a halacha, that Esav hates Yaakov. What does that mean? It's the connection between the non-Jews and the Jews, that the non-Jewish world, you'll never make peace with the children of Ishmael, as an example. That's the way it is. It's in the DNA. And this is, in a sense, something that he's already saying, that this anti-Semitism is a psychological pathology. It's an illness. It's a sickness. It's a cancer. That is what we would say nowadays. And that the only remedy was self-emancipation, not the emancipation with a capital E we've been talking about with the Haskalah, the Enlightenment. But the Jews need to stop looking for acceptance outside their own people and establish a national homeland for themselves. Remember, this is late 1800s, Pinsker, and he was, I guess, a good term to say about it, he wasn't geographically challenged. He was geographically agnostic, which meant he didn't necessarily have a direct connection to the land of Israel, that Palestine was, okay, maybe symbolically be nice, but he was open to any territory that would be willing to have in its country a sub-country, so to speak, of the Jews. He felt that we deserved, as a people, a country, self-determination, and he becomes one of the precursors of the modern Zionism movement. There's a term in Hebrew. I shall save it for next week for these kind of people who are like the mivasrim. They're like the ones who are giving the message. Okay. What's very interesting in his history, we talked about this at the very beginning of the class, not tonight, I'm talking about the course, so to speak, quite a long time ago, that things happen around the world in chunks. So, for example, when there was the American Revolution, French Revolution, the Jewish Revolution of Hasidut, all happening within the same period of time. You go back to the early 1990s, and you had the fall of communism from this country to this country to this country. You had the Arab Spring many years later after that. So a concept comes into the world, and somehow it makes its way around. So here you're having the early days of self-determination. This is a time period where eventually, when it comes to World War I, World War II, there's going to be this push for different nations and countries that Europe is going to get chopped up multiple times. That's why sometimes you'll hear someone say, "Oh yeah, my grandfather was born in what was Russia at the time, but now it's Ukraine," or whatever it might be, because borders shifted based on war, based on decisions. If the Treaty of Versailles means anything to you, which it will eventually when we get to it, but it was the whole purpose was determination as a nation. It was who we are. We are Poles. We are Ukrainians, we are Russians, we are French, and we need a land. So now the Jews, Pinsker is saying, along with others, we need our nation. He subsequently founded Chovevei Zion. I told you last week that there are terms you may have heard, and there are names of shuls, Chovevei Zion, Bilu, and others. We'll see Bilu in a few minutes. That where they got their name from, these shuls and others, were from these early movements of Zionism. He names this organization Chovevei Zion, Lovers of Zion. It's an umbrella organization for smaller societies in Russia and Romania who are dedicated to a settlement in what was then Ottoman Palestine. He says eventually comes to the conclusion that's where the Jews need to be. Now, what does this mean? Until now, there already were, because of pogroms and because of other things, whether it's after the Khmelnytsky massacre in the 1600s and all, the idea that the Jews need their own place is nothing new. It kind of goes back to last week's Parsha, what Hashem tells Abraham Avinu in 2 weeks ago in Lech Lecha. But the idea in modern times, quote unquote, is already taking root, but in small groups. There's nothing organized. There's no umbrella organization trying to do something. For those of you familiar with pre-state Israel, you had all the different factions and definitely different approaches to how to fight the enemy, whether it was the British or whether it was the Arabs, and whether it was the Palmach, and it was and Lehi and Etzel and the Stearns. All these, they had different approaches. There was no unification until, of course, we have the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. Same thing is happening at this point in history when it comes to the dream of Zionism. Again, I'm using the term very broadly right now, meaning a desire for a national homeland for the Jewish people. And Chovevei Zion's purpose was to organize expression of Jewish national activism. These people were activists. Now, nowadays, let's say, for example, let's say, God forbid, there was no land of Israel. There was a land of Israel. There's no Medinat Yisrael. There's no state yet. We're pre-state Israel. And there are people who decide, and also assume that the Muslims have not conquered a good part of the world already. And people decide in France and in England, the United States, you know what? We really need a homeland for the Jews. It's okay. All these countries, perfectly fine to be very open. And you say, we deserve a country. We should work for it. Back then, everything was shrouded in secrecy. Because if you're standing in Russia amidst the pogroms, you say, "Oh, we need our own state. Let's have some public meetings." You're toast. So these various groups were active, but they were under the radar. They're staying quiet. And Chovevei Zion's goal was to bring all these people together and have a common goal. The same climate of despair, idealism, leads a small group of Russian Jewish students to form another organization. It's called BILU. What is BILU? It's not a word, it's an acronym. It stands for Beit Yaakov Lechuv Elcha, House of Yaakov, let us get up and go. It's founded in 1882, so exactly at the same time. That's what I was saying before, it comes to history things, that all of a sudden an idea gets out there and starts to mushroom. In 1882, it's founded in Kharkov, and it typified the youthful, romantic dimension of Zionism, socialist utopianism, messianic impulse to go back to the land of Israel. And the people who were with Bilu saw the goal of let's just say, making aliyah, or settling the land of Israel, would only happen through manual labor and an agricultural life in Palestine. That would eventually lead to the moral growth of the Jewish people. Parenthetically, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about the problems they had, parenthetically, one big problem with this idea of taking all these people from Russia and sending them over to Palestine to settle the land and work the land, they had no experience. They weren't laborers. They weren't agriculture, especially agriculture. What did they know from growing and planting and harvesting? They didn't know anything, let alone, of course, all the disease that comes up, which we'll see. Their leader was a man named Israel Belkin, and he envisioned a Jewish society that would redeem the Jews from a diaspora existence, but not just the diaspora existence, but the degradations of diaspora. Everyone is looking at it in the general picture that it's a place, it's a refuge for the Jewish people. It still is, of course. But back then, is not the same situation as today. As bad as things are in some parts of the world right now, it is nowhere near what it was for the Jews back then. I'm talking about the 1800s. I'm not talking about pre-Holocaust times. So in 1882, a group of people from Bilu, what we would call pioneers, they arrive in Palestine, and they join together with members of Chovevei Zion to establish some agricultural colonies. You might have heard of some of them: Rishon LeZion, Gedera, Zichron Yaakov. These are, if you know the history of any of these cities, they started off very, I don't want to say meager, but very small. They started off very modest. But the difficulties that they had, it's very nice to be all gung-ho. You want to do something. Let's go to Palestine. Let's leave Russia. Let's leave Europe. And we're going to go and build the country. And we're going to get self-determination and emancipation. But they're forgetting something. And that something is the country itself had problems with malaria. The debt that was incurred by all these moves and bringing the people was immense, and they couldn't be paid back. They didn't have any experience. Like I said, they didn't have agricultural experience. They weren't planting things and growing wheat and corn and whatever else it might be in Russia. In addition to that, you have one thing that we still have to this very day: local hostility. And local hostility remains a thorn in the side of the Jewish people for years, and it's nothing new. If you remember Sefer Ezra Nehemiah, the Jews come back. It's called Shivat Zion. And by the way, this time period is known by the same name, Shivat Zion, the return to Zion. The time period of Ezra Nehemiah after the Jews were sent to exile after the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, come back to Israel, called Shivat Zion. Also now is called Shivat Zion of the 1800s into early 1900s. They come back to Israel. The goal is to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. They get permission from Koresh, from Cyrus, and they build it, and they stop for a number of years because there's all kinds of problems. They have internal squabbling. They have the non-Jewish people there. They're causing all kinds of problems. So it doesn't ever end. It doesn't end. It's Esav Sonei Yaakov. That's the theme that runs through everything. And yet at the same time, running parallel to that is our desire to have our own country where we have self-determination. Who helps in this early part of time? Of course, we talk about the Baron Edmund de Rothschild. We only talked about him briefly. We talked about Moses Montefiore in depth. We touched briefly on Edmund de Rothschild, that he was someone who was able to physically, psychologically, financially help renew the land of Israel. Lots of people died. Lots of people left who had come to Israel. They couldn't make it because of the sickness. They couldn't make it because they didn't know how to do what they needed to do. And because of debt. Parallel to this, again, we're talking the 1800s, along comes Herzl. This is now we flash back for just 1 minute to France. The Jewish nationalism movement, the idea is still fragmented. There's still within France and beyond a network of some colonies, so to speak, or groups who were philanthropists. There were scattered societies where there were some people who were ideologically involved in trying to see that there should be a land of Israel. And of course, the big transformation comes with Theodor Herzl. We've already spoken quite a bit about him, so I'm not going to get into him tonight. But it transforms at the same time between Bilu, Chovevei Zion, and Herzl and others whom we'll see shortly, this massive beginning of a movement. I say massive, it wasn't that big as far as the amount of people, but the power behind it and the amount of desire and the need was massive. The Zionist organization, which will later become the WZO, the World Zionist Organization, has a goal. And that goal is stated as a home for the Jewish people in Palestine secured by public law. That it would give Zionism its spine. What does that mean? Let's say I'm going to say we're going to have a new type of society. And it's going to be called Greenville. We all want Greenville. Great. What is that? Oh, we want to have all kinds of good stuff. Great. We want to have homes for everybody. Wonderful. We want to have farms and shared common property. Great. You're still not giving me a base. Give me a base. So the World Zionist Organization, their goal is this. It's very clear. It's a home for the Jewish people in what was then called Palestine, secured by public law. That meant that if you lived there, you were a full member of society. That meant that there were laws that applied to you and equally to everybody else in the country. And it gave a leg to stand on, at least in a theoretical point, for all the people who are first coming to Israel. While Herzl is looking for diplomatic legitimacy, if you remember, we talked about him 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, that he was not only trying to raise funds, but he's also trying to raise the legitimacy of having the Jews having their own country, self-determined. There's somebody else who's working in parallel. His name is Asher Ginsburg. The name may not mean anything to you, but you may know his pen name, which is Achad Ha'am. Literally means one of the people. You got to give yourself extra points if you know what that has to do with the parasha. And he has a critique against Herzl's approach. He believed that Herzl's approach was just a political concept. In other words, no different than Ukrainians wanting to have their own homeland, French having their own homeland. The Jews needed their own homeland. It was a purely political concept, of course, to get away from all the pogroms and everything else and the anti-Semitism, but that was it. But Asher Ginsburg, who's born near Kiev, he's raised in a traditional Hasidic environment. He receives both a Jewish and a Russian secular education. And by doing that, he becomes fluent in Hebrew, which was unheard of almost at that time, Russian, and also European philosophy. So he's got a lot of ideas in his head. He's originally drawn to Haskalah until he's disillusioned by the Haskalah. Remember, the Haskalah, or the Jewish Enlightenment, was more about becoming part of the society you're in, less Jewish, more French, less Jewish, more whatever, British. But for Ginsburg, the Jewish problem was not political only. Of course, it was political as well, but it was also spiritual. He's the first one now at this point, and there are others. We're going to talk about Yaakov Reines also, but at this moment, the one I'm talking about, the people we talked about so far, who's looking at this idea of Zionism from a spiritual perspective, that emancipation had produced an assimilated elite. In other words, the Jews were on the top of the game. We've talked about this about different countries where the Jews were involved in society, they were involved in politics and in law and in medicine, but they were detached from their Jewish roots. They were detached from their Jewish and ethical, cultural background. So he said, not a good idea. He decides to write some essays. He wrote one, Lo Zu Haderech, in 1889, another one, Emet Me'eretz Yisrael, in 1891. And he believed, and he wrote that Palestine could not absorb and support mass immigration and support statehood. It wasn't going to happen. But what we have to do is we have to work on it in stages. And that instead of this mass immigration to Israel, there would be something in Israel that would radiate to the diaspora. What does that mean? That Israel should be like a central point, or a merkaz ruchani, a spiritual cultural center, and that Kimitzion Tetzei Torah, from the Zion comes Torah, that would then radiate to outside of Israel. Not that we could get everyone to come all now, but he felt that would be a small, good, strong nucleus with core people come and do this. The words merkaz ruchani eventually are adopted also, we'll see, by somebody else, which become known as, wait for it, Mizrahi. Mizrahi is actually an acronym of a shortening of two words, merkaz ruchani, or spiritual center. That's where the word comes from. I remember many, many, many years ago in Chicago, when we established, there was this time period where all these different chapters of Apol Mizrahi in Chicago had different chapters. And when I got married, about a year after we got married, there was a gap between our age group and maybe 15 years later was the first real, or 15 years older than us, I should say, was the first chapter, was the next chapter for Mizrahi. So myself and a few others we were approached by Mizrahi about starting a young chapter, or people in our 20s, a long time ago. And I guess because I got involved, I became the president of the chapter. And we went to one of our first meetings, and we're sitting there, and the one running the meeting said, okay, especially for you new people, well, we were new to the organization, Mizrahi, what does it mean? Anyone know? None of us had a clue. So we were taught. It's Merkaz Ruchani. That's where it comes from. And Rav Reines is the one who really makes that more popular. We'll come to him soon, either tonight or next week. B'ezrat Hashem. He, meaning Achad Ha'am, accused those people who were political Zionists, meaning that didn't involve Torah or spirituality or a real Jewish basis for their Zionism. He accused these people who were just political Zionists of just mimicking European nationalism. And he felt that would be very hollow. In other words, you want to take the Jews of France, let's make up an example. You want to take the Jews of France who are enlightened, who are not going to be, who are don't want to be there now because of the anti-Semitism, transplant them to Israel, and they're just going to be enlightened Jews there. No necessarily connection to the land as far as history, no connection necessarily because of the holiness, no connection to Torah. So that would be a hollow victory. Achad Ha'am's influence that went beyond ideology. He was an editor of a Hebrew journal called Hashiloach, and he ended up mentoring a generation of writers, educators, who eventually lay the foundation for what becomes modern Hebrew and modern Hebrew literature. Obviously, the star of that group of people is Eliezer ben Yehuda. Eliezer ben Yehuda is a person we will definitely talk about, B'ezrat Hashem, who gave birth to what we call modern Hebrew, but not yet. We're going to have to wait to get to him, because if we talked already about Kinsker, and we talked about Achad Ha'am, and we talked about others before, we need to talk, especially for those of us who would say we connect with the Mizrahi movement, we need to talk about Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Reines. He was one of the founders of what eventually becomes known as Mizrahi. What's amazing is you took a look at pictures. I should have done this, but I didn't think before, but I should maybe for next time. Take a look at pictures of all these early people that were involved in Mizrahi, including Rabbi Reines and others. And you see them today, you would look at them and say, oh my God, they are just uber Haredi looking. Long beards, hats. So that's exactly what they look. That's what they look like. But it didn't come with all the trappings in the perspective of today. In any case, Rav Reines is born near Pinsk. At that point, when he was born, it was part of the Russian Empire. He's born in 1859. He grows up in a rabbinic family. That the family itself was known for its Torah, for its learning, for being educators as well. And he himself was seen as a prodigy as a young man. Now, this sounds familiar because when we were talking about the leaders, those people became leaders in the 1700s in the Hasidic and in the non-Hasidic, especially the non-Hasidic world, he kept saying, oh, he grew up in a rabbinic family and he just was like seen as a genius early on. It happens. These people shine. But he was known for both his Torah knowledge and his piety. He studied in several elite yeshivot in Lithuania, and he becomes known as a very sharp intellect, a very sharp individual. And he was a person that had a tremendous amount of a curious nature. He wanted to know how, why. He wasn't only interested in learning the Talmud. You find very often that many of the Gedolim from the 1700s, the 1600s, the 1800s, that's their focus, Talmud study. But he was also interested in broadening that. Philosophy, logic, secular knowledge. But he had this dual commitment, therefore, to Torah and general wisdom, which becomes the hallmark of his life. Sound familiar? Again, the things that get intertwined when we talked about Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. We also talked about the basis of what eventually becomes known as now as Torah Umada, Torah and Derech Eretz from his time period, the melding of the Torah world and the non-Torah world. Everything's Torah, but you know, I'm talking the secular world. But of course, that the thing that takes primacy is the Torah part of it, because that becomes the hallmark of his life. His educational philosophy was very much in line with the concept of what he would refer to as religious Zionism. When Herzl launches the Zionist movement, which basically we could trace back to Herzl himself as a movement, Reines recognized that there would be a tremendous opportunity right now for the Jewish people. It's not just, oh, the Jews are running from pogroms and anti-Semitism, we're going to transplant, we're going to have our own country, but that it would be a Jewish national homeland with spiritual renewal. He became one of the first Orthodox rabbis to publicly support Herzl's Zionism because he saw it as a sign from Hashem that it's time for the rebirth of the Jewish people. In 1902, he officially founds the Mizrahi movement, again, Merkaz Ruchani, using those two words, religious Zionist organization with a very broad Zionist framework, keeping in mind that we have a Zionist movement that's involved in just we need it for political reasons. There's others which we didn't talk about for labor reasons. There's other ones for religious reasons. That's why I said at the beginning of the class tonight that there are many paths to Zionism and many flavors in Zionism. At the Fifth Zionist Congress in Basel, 1901, Reines was the leader of the Orthodox faction, and he laid down the principles of Mizrahi. Number one, Zionism is to be guided by Torah values and religious ideals. Secondly, he said that it's not just political or secular nationalism. It had to be way beyond that. Everything had to take Torah into consideration. He was first president of Mizrahi, and he influences many other people later. For example, Rabbi Meir Bar Ilan, Rav Kook, in some degree. His vision was pragmatic and idealistic at the same time. Usually you don't have those two at the same time, but you do have the same two. He saw Zionism not just as a refuge for Jews who were suffering, but a catalyst for moral and religious growth, rejuvenation. And he believed and he felt and he taught that the Jews returning to the land of Israel was a divinely sanctioned historical process. I'm going to stop here because I made a decision that I'm going to, next week, Bezrat Hashem, we're going to digress for a moment and we're going to discuss that topic, a divinely sanctioned historical process, because the same arguments that were made back then about why we should make Aliyah, why we should not make Aliyah, you still hear in some circles today. We're going to talk a little bit about it. I'm going to give a shiur. It won't be the whole class. It's going to be part of it. Something I did a few years ago in a different class. I'm going to talk about this whole idea of the mitzvah of Aliyah. He's saying basically saying there's a mitzvah of Aliyah. And there are people who say, not as a mitzvah, you shouldn't make Aliyah until Mashiach comes, or because it's too dangerous, da, 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 da. So we're going to talk about that, Bezrat Hashem, next week. And then we're going to get back to, after we finish with Rav Reines, we're also going to get talking about Herzl just for a minute or two again, and some other leaders of the Zionist movement. So in the meantime, have a wonderful evening. It is still Tuesday. It was the Jewish history class. I'm just telling myself so I remember what we were doing tonight. And have a wonderful evening. Besorot tovot, everybody.